Hello and welcome. Tonight, allow me to guide you softly into the hushed corners of the past, where the ticking of time is slower, where voices fade into the tapestry of memory, and where each story drifts forward like the gentle pull of the tide. Make yourself comfortable, let your eyes grow heavy if they wish, and together we shall begin. Tonight's tale will wander through the halls and chambers of medieval courts, following the lives of royal women. Not the gilded fantasy of fairy tales, but the truth as it was lived. Behind heavy velvet curtains and guarded gates, they were queens and princesses, daughters and wives, bound by duty, watched by all, and yet often unseen as themselves. In this story, we will tread softly into their mornings and nights, into the long silences between grand events, and into the private burdens no chronicler wrote of. The air in a royal bedchamber at dawn was often chill, even in summer. Stone walls breathed in the night's coolness and returned it in the morning, so that even silken bedclothes could not quite keep the bite away. A princess might wake to the rustle of her ladies-in-waiting, their soft chatter blending with the low crackle of a hearth newly stirred to life. The first sensation was always the same, the weight of the day settling before the first step was taken. For a royal woman, the day was never her own. Her rising was a ceremony in itself. The first gown, often a loose robe for warmth, was slipped over her shoulders while her hair, an emblem of youth and virtue, was brushed until it shone. Behind these motions was a quiet choreography of control. The ladies did not simply serve. They observed, noting her mood, her health, even the faintest trace of melancholy. These details would travel further than any whispered word she might give them. By mid-morning, she would be in the presence of others, perhaps in a solar flooded with light, perhaps in a draughty hall. There would be embroidery frames, letters to dictate, petitions to hear from servants, sometimes lessons in scripture or music if she was still young enough to be in training for her future role. All the while, every movement was measured, every expression watched. The knowledge that a misplaced word could ripple outward into rumour was as constant a companion as her own shadow. Meals, when they came, were rarely private. They might be taken with a husband she scarcely knew, with relatives who measured her worth in her ability to bear heirs, or with visiting envoys who weighed her every remark against the fortunes of their own courts. Even in the clatter of platters and the aroma of roasted meats, she could feel the invisible net of expectation. To be pleasing, to be intelligent but never too bold, to display grace under the steady gaze of eyes trained to find fault. There were quiet moments too, though never truly alone. A book of hours in hand, she might retreat to a window seat, the sunlight pooling on the page. From there, she could watch the courtyard below, squires moving between stables and hall, merchants unloading carts, the distant shimmer of guards in armour. These glimpses of ordinary life beyond her reach could be both a comfort and a torment. The court was a place of endless listening. A royal woman heard far more than she spoke. She would hear the careful language of counsellors as they discussed treaties over her dowry, the murmurs of servants sharing news before they realised she was near, the brittle laughter of other noblewomen whose friendship could never be fully trusted. In these fragments, she pieced together a map of power and danger, one she had to navigate without ever letting the map itself be seen. Sometimes the day would bring ceremonies, a feast for a visiting noble, a blessing from a bishop, the presentation of gifts from a far-off land. These were moments when her presence was part of the pageantry, her gown heavy with embroidery, her hair set in elaborate coils, her face carefully composed into serene perfection. Behind the stillness, though, there could be a racing heart, especially if the event hinted at shifts in her fate. The arrival of a potential suitor, a marriage negotiation whispered about but not yet confirmed. As evening fell, the court's pace slowed but did not stop. Candles flickered in sconces, their light gilding the stone with a softer glow. The air carried the mingled scents of wax, wine, and the faint sharpness of rushes strewn on the floor. In these hours, the weight of the day pressed more heavily, for the night offered no real escape, only the privacy of a guarded chamber, the company of attendants who slept lightly, and the thoughts she dared not speak aloud. For some, there were letters to write before retiring, to parents far away, to siblings married into other courts, to friends left behind in childhood. These letters were both lifeline and risk, for once sent, they passed through many hands, and a single careless phrase could be read in ways she never intended. Yet to keep silent entirely was worse. Words, even caged in ink, were a form of breath. When the bedchamber door closed and the fire burned low, the quiet was complete. And in that stillness, the truth of her life was clearest. She could feel the shape of the crown's invisible weight, the narrow path she must walk to keep from falling into disgrace or irrelevance. She might lie awake, listening to the distant footsteps of guards, wondering what changes tomorrow might bring, and which would come without warning at all. And so the day of a royal woman would pass, not with the storms and clashes of battles, but with the unbroken discipline of survival within walls as high and unyielding as the expectations that shaped her life. Each dawn would call her again into the delicate dance of duty, silence and watchfulness, a dance from which there was no bowing out. In the heart of a medieval castle, mornings were never truly quiet, even if they began in stillness. By the time the first grey light touched the high, narrow windows, the corridors outside a royal woman's chambers were already alive with movement. The muffled tread of servants carrying ewers of fresh water, the clink of keys on the chatelain's belt, the murmur of voices that never quite broke into full conversation. For the queen, or the young princess learning to become one, the day's duties began before she had spoken a word. Her ladies-in-waiting were the first to enter, bowing with practiced grace before tending to her. There was a strange intimacy to their presence. They saw her when no one else did, hair unbound, face unpainted, mind not yet locked into the armour of composure. And yet, they were not confidantes in the way that childhood friends could be. They belonged to the court as much as she did, bound by their own loyalties, their own caution. Her gown for the morning would be chosen not for her comfort, but for the day's schedule. If there were meetings with dignitaries, the fabric would be rich and the colours symbolic. Deep crimson for majesty, blue for devotion, gold for prosperity. The embroidery might whisper of alliances, a border of lilies for France, a scattering of roses for England, a discreet clasp in the shape of a falcon for her family's emblem. Every thread carried meaning, and every meaning was meant to be read. The walk to the chapel was a daily ritual. It wound through passages lined with tapestries depicting saints, battles, and parables. She could feel the chill of the flagstones under her thin slippers, smell the beeswax from the candles already lit ahead of the service. Here, in the echoing quiet of prayer, she could at least lower her gaze and let her thoughts drift, though even in worship she was being watched. A queen's piety was part of her image, and the bishop's eyes would note whether she seemed humble, attentive, appropriately devout. After prayers came audiences. These could range from the intimate, a mother receiving reports from her children's tutors, to the grand, in which ambassadors knelt to present letters sealed in foreign wax. Every encounter was a negotiation, even those disguised as mere pleasantries. A royal woman had to weigh her words like gold, knowing that too much warmth could be seen as weakness, too much reserve as insult. She learned to listen far more than she spoke, to measure the tilt of her head, the length of her pause, the curve of her smile. By midday, the castle's rhythm shifted. Courtyards filled with the metallic clash of training knights, the smell of roasting meat drifted up from the kitchens, and the chambers grew warmer with the sun. Luncheon was taken in company, perhaps with favoured courtiers, perhaps with visiting lords. For a royal woman, this was another stage, her seat at the head or beside her husband a signal to all present. The food might be rich, swan in almond sauce, trout glazed with herbs, but it was not a feast for her pleasure. Each bite, each sip of spiced wine was punctuated by conversation she could not afford to ignore. In the afternoon, she might be summoned to the Queen's Solar, a sunlit chamber set high in a tower where the air smelled faintly of lavender and warm wood. Here, noblewomen gathered to embroider, to exchange guarded words and to gauge one another's standing. In these rooms, politics flowed beneath the surface, carried in half-finished sentences, in the way a question was phrased, in the silence after a remark. Friendships here could be genuine, but they were rarely simple. One could never be certain how much of a smile was for affection and how much was for advantage. Sometimes the afternoons were broken by the arrival of messengers. They came travel-stained and weary, bearing tidings from distant lands, a cousin's marriage, a border skirmish, a sudden death in a noble house. Such news could shift the balance of her life without warning. A brother's wedding might mean new alliances to navigate. A lord's death might open the question of an inheritance tied to her dowry. And in the unspoken undercurrent, there was always the possibility of change in her own fate. A marriage arrangement altered, a child betrothed, a political match proposed or undone. Toward evening, the castle grew dimmer, the lights slanting low through windows set deep in the stone. Torches were lit in the corridors, casting long shadows across the floor. Supper might be a smaller, more intimate meal, taken with family and closest advisors. Yet even then, informality was rare. The king's mood could shift with the day's news, and a single careless remark might linger in his memory longer than the meal itself. After supper, there were entertainments, musicians playing the lute and vielle, poets reciting verses, jesters weaving humour into sly commentary. The royal woman's presence at these gatherings was expected, and her reactions were observed as carefully as they had been in chapel that morning. A misplaced laugh at a two-pointed jest could be noted and carried into gossip. A lack of enthusiasm could be seen as disapproval. When the night drew near, she withdrew to her chambers once more. The fire was built high against the creeping cold, and the air filled with the faint herbal scent of rushes replaced earlier in the day. There might be a final round of discussion with her ladies, practical matters of the morrow's duties, or a recitation of the day's events. Beneath these exchanges, though, lay the quiet truth. The walls of her world were high and their stones were not easily moved. Lying in bed, she might hear the faint strain of music still drifting from the great hall, or the echo of armoured boots on the courtyard stones. The night could be peaceful, but never entirely free, for even in dreams, the weight of the crown followed her, invisible and inescapable. There was a moment, often overlooked by the chroniclers who loved to tally battles and dowries, when a royal girl first realised that the shape of her life would be drawn by other hands. It might come while her hair was being braided for a feast, or when a seal of some distant prince was shown to her on a strip of ribbon, a device she could copy with needle and silk, but would never truly own. In that moment, the corridors of the castle seemed to narrow, and the windows, so high and thin, seemed to look not onto hills and fields, but onto a road leading away. The word that followed her was arrangement. Men arranged, she was arranged. She learned the vocabulary of negotiation before she learned the language of love. The talk began with soft edges. A bishop lingered longer than usual after supper. A foreign envoy asked after her health with a care that felt larger than courtesy. A chest arrived from a distant court, full of fabrics dyed in a shade favoured by a prince she had never seen. These were the signs that seasoned women of the household read with the accuracy of astronomers. Her mother's smile sharpened by a fraction. Her governess grew exacting about posture, about French or Latin declensions, about the proper angle of her head when listening to a man of great importance. Word by word, lesson by lesson, the loom of her future tightened. When the letters finally came, bearing crests impressed deep enough to dent the table, they were read aloud in the great chamber, the syllables floating into the rafters like incense smoke. Terms were measured, lineage recited, alliances weighed like grain. Her name sat in the middle of text that spoke about lands, ports and peace, as if she were a bridge that could never crack. There was honour in this, the elders said. There was purpose. She learned to nod with quiet grace, to let the words of agreement settle upon her like a heavy cloak she must wear in all seasons. The betrothal itself was a ritual of bright colours and quiet fear. Rings were exchanged, sometimes blessed before an altar, sometimes merely witnessed by men who kept careful notes. Musicians played, pages scattered herbs beneath the couple's feet, and the older women watched for omens. A candle that sputtered, a bird that struck the glass of a window. The girl was praised for her poise. She was told how happy the people were, how grateful. She smiled and felt the smile growing distant, as if it belonged to a portrait being painted in another room. The prince, if he was present at all, was a stranger with a gentle hand or a firm one, with eyes that looked into hers or past her altogether. If he was absent, he existed only in the way others said his name. There followed the careful business of packing a life into trunks. Books of hours illuminated by family hands, a reliquary with a sliver of bone, veils smelling faintly of lavender, a set of knives with handles carved like vines, letters tied in ribbon for reading on the road. A small basket of earth might be included, a token of home to be sprinkled into the hearth of her new chambers. Superstition, some said. Comfort, others insisted. The women of her household folded and refolded linens, murmured advice about managing servants, about the right balance between generosity and distance. The farewell gifts were meant to protect her, though none could guard against the most ordinary kind of loneliness. The journey itself was a pageant and an unveiling. Towns on the route lined their streets with garlands. The people came to see her the way they might come to see an eclipse. She rode with her ladies, her spine a rod of calm, offering a lifted hand to bless children pressed forward by their mothers. Jests were thrown like pennies. Prayers were called like bells. At the borders, the world shifted. Men in new colours took up the escort. The language around her softened and sharpened in unfamiliar places. She learned to smile when she missed a word, to repeat a phrase until it fit in her mouth like a bead on a string. Arrival at the foreign court was both echo and thunder. Trumpets said what words could not. Doors opened onto halls where tapestries told stories she did not know, saints with different attributes, kings whose victories were not the ones she had learned. Her future mother-in-law appraised her with a glance owned by years of rule within rules, and the ladies of the new household measured her jewels, her bearing, her very heartbeat. She was shown rooms with windows facing a different sun, a chapel with different favours at the altar. The air carried new scents, resin from other forests, spices from ports that were not her father's, a sweetness she could not name. Then came the public vows. The gown for the wedding was a field of stitched light, and the weight of it pressed on her shoulders until she felt she was learning to stand anew. She walked between lines of faces like the banks of a river, and every pair of eyes was a pebble, each cool against her skin. The vows themselves were simple words, gilded by gold leaf in the telling but plain in the mouth, to honour, to obey, to bear children if God allowed. The ring slid onto her finger, and with it the centuries. When they knelt, the priest's breath mingled with their own. He spoke of the mystery of union, as if it were a garment she could pull around her when the wind rose. The feast was a living tapestry of abundance, roasted peacocks dressed again in their feathers, pies releasing doves when cut, wine that filled and refilled cups as if the barrels beneath the castle were bottomless. She ate little and smiled much. Songs were composed for the moment, and in them she was named as hope, as peace, as the mother of future kings. She learned how public joy can be a careful melody played over a private hum of unease. As the evening lengthened, gifts were paraded, salt as precious as coin, tapestries threaded with gold, a hawk hooded in velvet. Each was a promise, each another strand in the binding rope of alliance. What could not be avoided was the last ritual of the night, the bedding, which was less about tenderness than about proof. The chamber chosen for the act was watched by more people than any secret should bear. Ladies guided her into night clothes finer than mist. Men laughed too loudly in the antechamber. Elder matrons offered advice, blunt enough to make the blood rise in her cheeks. When the doors finally closed and the laughter muffled, there remained two strangers under one canopy, charged with a duty that did not wait upon affection. There were couples who found grace in that first joining, and there were those who found only the edge of a blade named expectation. In either case, the sheets would be inspected, the whispers would travel, and the history would begin to tally. In the days that followed, she began the delicate work of learning a household that was now hers to manage, but not hers to command entirely. Names were memorised, old loyalties respected, new allies courted with kindnesses that appeared effortless. The prince's habits became the stars by which she navigated. The hour he preferred for counsel, the food he avoided, the jest that softened his jaw. She learned to balance a ledger and a temper to soothe a quarrel between two servants whose feud predated her arrival, to understand which monk in the scriptorium could be coaxed into copying a letter more swiftly when given a bit of sugared almond. Neither poets nor chroniclers lingered on the quiet bravery of that learning, the courage required to lay oneself gently over a bed of thorns and call it home. Yet in that softness lay a steel that would be asked of her again and again. She had crossed a threshold that could not be crossed twice. The road behind was closed, the road ahead waited without promises, and still, morning came, as it always did, pale and serious, asking her to rise. The first weeks in a new court were a season of testing, though it was rarely called by that name. Every glance, every murmur in a hallway, every request from a servant was a quiet measure of how well the new princess or queen could bend without breaking. She learned quickly that a foreign household was not a single body, but 100 small currents, each flowing in its own direction. Some sought to pull her into their stream, offering smiles and small gifts, while others tested the firmness of her footing with subtle slights. A chair left unoffered, a name forgotten in public. Her mornings began earlier now, for her duties had multiplied. The stewardship of her new household was a task of many layers, overseeing the storerooms, approving purchases for the kitchens, deciding which artisans would receive commissions for gowns, tapestries and jewels. It was a dance of economy and display, to appear generous but not wasteful, to reward loyalty without showing favouritism too openly. The balance was delicate. For every coin she spent was a message. The great hall in daylight was more a place of business than feasting. Messengers arrived with scrolls bound in wax, and she was expected to sit beside her husband as he heard petitions. Though she did not speak in council unless invited, her silence was not emptiness. It was a canvas onto which others painted their impressions of her. A well-timed nod, the slight narrowing of her eyes, even the way her hands rested in her lap, all were noticed. She began to understand the strange power of stillness, the way it could unsettle those who expected easy warmth. Her afternoons were often occupied by acts that the outside world imagined as leisure. Riding in the gardens with her ladies was as much about visibility as pleasure. Those who watched from the walls would report on her poise, her skill with the reins, whether her laughter rang true or hollow. Embroidery in the solar was not merely craft, but a stage upon which she could display piety, refinement, and patience. When she chose the image of a saint to stitch, the choice was itself a statement. Saint Margaret for perseverance, Saint Catherine for learning, Saint Anne for devotion to family. Every needle's pierce into the cloth was another small act of diplomacy. There were days when she was summoned to the Queen Mother, whose approval was as vital as the king's. These meetings were steeped in courtesy but sharpened beneath the surface. The elder woman would inquire about the state of the household, offer guidance that was also veiled critique, and recount stories from her own early days that carried more warning than comfort. It was a lesson in how power could be exercised without ever raising the voice. A smile, a pause, a sudden change of subject that left no doubt about its meaning. Among the women of the court, friendships began to take shape like frost on a window, intricate, delicate, and always vulnerable to a sudden change in temperature. There was Lady Isabel, who knew every whisper before it finished crossing a room. Lady Claire, whose laughter was disarming but whose loyalties were carefully kept in shadow, and Lady Marriott, whose shy demeanour hid a mind that remembered every debt and slight. These women were not merely companions. They were both allies and rivals, bound together by the peculiar closeness of life in a palace. A careless word in their presence could be carried farther than a royal seal. Her new husband was, at first, more a figure than a partner. He was courteous, even gentle, but he belonged to the machinery of state, and much of his day was consumed by hunting, councils, and matters of law. Their shared time was limited to meals, formal audiences, and the hours behind closed doors. Hours that could be companionable or silent, depending on his mood. She studied him as she studied the court, the way he lingered over certain reports, the rare moments when his formality softened, the guarded look that crossed his face when foreign envoys were mentioned. The chapel became her refuge, though it was rarely empty. Here, Kneeling in the dim light, she could let her thoughts drift without fear of them being read on her face. The Latin prayers fell into a rhythm that was both familiar and foreign, and she learned the names of saints venerated in this land. She made offerings at their altars, coins, candles, or, on one occasion, the veil she had worn on her wedding day. Each act both a gesture of faith and a quiet weaving of herself into the fabric of this place. In the evenings, the great hall transformed. Long trestle tables groaned under platters of roasted meats, trenchers of bread, bowls spiced stews. Music from lutes and rebecks wound between the pillars, and the shadows of dancers flickered on the stone walls. She sat at the high table, her back to the tapestries, her face turned toward the hall. The people below her, knights, merchants, visiting nobles, were not just guests, they were a mirror of the court's health. Laughter meant stability. Hushed tones meant unease. She learned to read the mood of the realm in the way she once read the weather in the clouds. Not all evenings were devoted to feasts. There were more intimate gatherings in smaller chambers, where the air was heavy with the scent of wine and resin from the brazier. Here, political discussions flowed under the guise of casual talk, and she was expected to contribute with wit and discretion. A misplaced remark could ripple outward, reaching ears far from that warm circle of light. She learned the art of answering without revealing, of offering words that seemed clear but left no true path for others to follow back to her thoughts. On certain nights she was invited to witness matters of justice. These sessions were neither swift nor gentle. Petty disputes over land or debt could be settled in minutes, but accusations of treason or blasphemy could stretch into hours. Each word weighed as if it might tip the balance of the realm itself. Her presence was symbolic, a reminder that mercy was as much a royal virtue as judgment, but it was also instructive. She saw how the king's counsellors shaped a case, how they sought to turn uncertainty into certainty, and how the condemned looked when they realised the verdict had already been decided. There were moments of beauty too, that belonged to no ceremony or duty. Once at dusk, she stood in the castle's highest tower and watched the river below turn silver under the fading sky. Once she heard the stable boys singing as they worked, their voices untrained, but full of something freer than any ballad sung in the hall. These small things did not change her position, but they anchored her within it, reminding her that life beyond the court's pageantry was still being lived, and that she, in her own way, was living it too. Yet the undercurrent of scrutiny never ceased. Every kindness could be mistaken for favouritism, every absence for disapproval, every choice for something more than it was. In this new life, even silence spoke, and she was learning to make it say what she wished. The first winter in her new home came early, cloaking the castle in a stillness that felt almost alive. Snow lay heavy on the battlements, softening their sharp lines, and the wind hummed low in the chimneys like a voice that would not be silenced. For a royal woman, winter was a season that altered the rhythm of life, but not the demands placed upon her. The great hall burned with more torches, the hearths piled high with logs that hissed and spat, yet the cold found its way into every seam of stone. Mornings began in the dim half-light, the windows frosted so thickly that the world beyond was only a blur of white and grey. Servants padded in with braziers of glowing coal, setting them near her chair and bed to take the edge from the air. Her gowns grew heavier, lined with fur at the sleeves and hem, the weight of them pressing at her shoulders. Even so, the chill lingered on her fingers as she signed documents or traced her embroidery. Winter's confinement meant more hours in the solar, where the women of the household gathered to work and talk. The fire's glow painted their faces in amber, and the scent of dried rosemary and cloves hung in the air from the herbs kept in earthen jars. Here, news from the outside world arrived in fragments. A messenger delayed by snow, a merchant bringing tales of frostbitten villages, a travelling minstrel speaking of roads closed until spring. The conversations turned often to the health of the people, for winter was the season when illness travelled swiftly through the narrow streets beyond the castle gates. In these months, her duties shifted subtly. She was expected to show greater presence among her husband's subjects, though not always in person. Coins from the royal treasury were given in her name to churches for the poor, blankets and food sent to villages most in need. These acts were both mercy and message, for the people would remember not only that aid had come, but whose hand had extended it. She understood now that generosity in a queen's life was as political as it was moral. The feasts of winter were grander in appearance, though often poorer in variety. The fruits and greens of summer were long gone, replaced by salted meats, pickled vegetables, and pies thick with preserved fruits. Spices were used lavishly, not only for flavour but as a sign of wealth, for they came from far-off lands. On feast days, the hall was dressed in evergreen boughs and bright berries, the air thick with the mingled scents of pine and roasting game. She sat at the high table beside her husband, her presence part of the tapestry of celebration, the living image of the court's prosperity. Entertainment took on a different tone in winter. The long, dark evenings invited storytelling by the fire, performances of mummers and jesters, and games of wit played at the tables. She learned that laughter in winter was a necessary warmth, a way of keeping spirits from sinking under the weight of the season. But it was also in these dimly lit gatherings that rumours travelled most easily, carried like sparks from one whispered exchange to another. When the snow deepened and the roads became nearly impassable, the castle's world grew smaller. People saw more of each other, and in that closeness tensions sharpened. Old grievances between servants resurfaced. Minor slights among courtiers became larger than they were, and the watchfulness in the queen's role became more demanding. She learned to read the signs of unrest before they blossomed into open quarrel, to ease one conversation while redirecting another, to keep the air from growing too still. Her husband, during these months, was more often in her company. Hunting was rare in the deep snow, so he spent more time in council or at her side in the great hall. There were evenings when they spoke at length, discussing matters of the realm, the health of the people and the affairs of the court. There were also nights when his thoughts seemed far away, his replies brief, his gaze fixed on something beyond the chamber's walls. She had learned not to press him in those moments, for power often brought burdens that could not be shared, even between husband and wife. The chapel in winter was a place of both comfort and solemnity. The cold stone floor was covered in fresh rushes, and the flicker of many candles made the shadows dance on the vaulted ceiling. Services felt longer in the season's chill, the prayers heavier. She knelt wrapped in fur-lined mantles, her breath visible in the cold air, and thought often of the people beyond the castle walls whose homes had no brazier, whose food was counted in mouthfuls. The image of herself as their guardian became more tangible in these moments, not as a title, but as a task. One evening, when the snow lay so thick that the castle seemed an island in a white sea, she stood at the window of her chamber and looked out at the night. The moonlight turned the courtyard to silver, the roofs to shapes cut from crystal. No sound reached her but the faint creak of ice on the river below. In that stillness, she felt both the vastness and the limits of her life, how the walls protected her and held her, how the crown weighed and warmed in equal measure. The winter would pass, as all winters did, but she sensed even then that the season had taught her something lasting, that in the cold and closeness, a royal woman's strength was not shown in grand gestures alone, but in the quiet keeping of peace, in the tending of both hearth and heart, until the first green shoots returned to the world. The thaw began so slowly that at first it was hardly noticed. A faint trickle of water down the inner walls of the well, a softer note in the wind that moved through the courtyard, the faintest scent of damp earth in the air. By the time the snow on the castle roofs began to slide in heavy sheets, the people of the household had already turned their thoughts towards spring. For her, the change of season brought a new kind of labour. Winter's quiet confinements gave way to a calendar crowded with audiences, preparations for the year's first hunts, and the arrival of merchants eager to show their wares. The Queen's chambers, once a place of layered warmth and measured stillness, were now a crossroads of tailors, jewellers and scribes. There were bolts of fresh-dyed wool to be examined, silks from far ports to be weighed in the hand, and new patterns for gowns to be chosen with care. Each selection was more than personal taste. It was an unspoken declaration of the court's wealth, its connections, and its aspirations. The great hall, now brighter with sunlight, shifted in tone as well. The smoke from winter's constant fires cleared, and the light caught the gilded edges of the carved beams overhead. Here, ambassadors from distant lands were welcomed, their cloaks still dusted with the road, their eyes searching for signs of the court's strength. Her role was to greet them with gracious formality, to speak in a way that hinted at warmth but revealed little, to make them believe that this court, her court now, was secure, prosperous and firmly united. One of the earliest duties of spring was the blessing of the fields, a tradition older than the walls themselves. Though she did not walk the farmlands as the peasants did, she rode in procession with the king and his retinue to the village nearest the castle. The people lined the muddy lanes, their clothes still patched from winter wear, their faces turned up with curiosity and expectation. She handed out coins to the children, blessed the baskets of seed brought to her, and listened to the parish priest's long prayer for good weather and a rich harvest. It was a performance of care, but it was also genuine. She felt the eyes of the people on her, measuring her kindness as much as her finery. Back in the castle, the approach of warmer days also meant the resumption of outdoor pastimes. Gardens that had been bare but for the skeletal outlines of hedges began to show green again. She walked their paths with her ladies, planning new plantings. Rosemary for remembrance, violets for humility, roses for honour. These choices were not only for beauty. In a royal garden, every flower might speak to the court's values, and those who visited would take note. Spring brought with it an increase in visitors. Relatives from other courts arrived, some bearing gifts, others bringing questions and proposals in person rather than by letter. The Queen was expected to host them with grace, to ensure that each felt honoured but none felt favoured above the rest. This required careful seating at tables, a distribution of attention so precise it could not be left to chance. She had learned to watch for the flicker of an expression when someone was placed further down the table than they expected, or when a cup was refilled for one guest more quickly than another. Her husband's time grew busier, with hunts to lead, councils to attend, and disputes between lords to settle before the summer campaigning season began. Their moments together were often late in the evening, when the corridors were quiet and the fires low. Sometimes they spoke of the day's events, sometimes of nothing at all. The silence between them not unfriendly, but edged with the weight of their separate responsibilities. As the sun returned to the land, so too did the undercurrents of rivalry within the court. Long winters could bury certain grievances under the necessity of shared shelter, but spring uncovered them again. She noticed the shifting alliances among her ladies, the careful manoeuvring of those who sought her favour for their own kin, the calculated generosity of certain courtiers whose gifts came with invisible strings. She responded with measured courtesy, neither discouraging such approaches nor accepting them too openly. There were festivals as well, some joyous, others solemn. At the feast of Easter, she wore a gown of pale gold and carried a candle in the chapel procession, the wax dripping slowly onto her gloved hand. At May Day, she was crowned with flowers by the village girls, a custom her husband allowed, though some courtiers found it undignified. She felt the weight of both crowns, the living flowers that would fade within hours, and the unseen metal that never left her head. In the quietest hours, she still found moments to herself. On certain mornings, before the household fully stirred, she would stand at the open window and breathe in the cold, wet scent of the new season. Beyond the walls, she could hear the first cartwheels of the day on the road, the call of a bird she had not heard since autumn. These were not grand events, but they reminded her that life was more than ceremony, that somewhere beyond the polished surface of the court, time was marked by simpler, steadier rhythms. Yet even as the days lengthened and warmed, the demands upon her did not lessen. Spring was not a respite. It was the opening note of the year's busiest symphony, and every measure required her presence. The months ahead would bring tournaments, treaties, and perhaps even war. And through them all, she would remain as she had learned to be, the calm face of a realm that could not afford to show its storms. Summer in the castle did not arrive all at once. It came in the soft greening of the outer hills, in the longer light that lingered at the edge of evening, in the hum of bees drifting lazily through open windows. By June, the air inside the thick walls was cool even when the sun burned hot in the courtyards. The Queen's chambers, with their high arched windows, filled with the scent of fresh rushes newly strewn across the floor, mixed with lavender from the gardens below. Summer was a season of both display and vigilance. With the roads clear and the rivers swift, visitors arrived in a steady stream, lords from distant provinces, envoys bearing messages sealed with foreign crests, and noblewomen whose marriages into other realms still tethered them in some quiet way to this court. The Great Hall became a place of constant movement, with banquets prepared almost as often as councils convened. Her role in each was distinct, yet equally demanding: the smiling hostess at the feast, the still and attentive listener in the council chamber. Tournaments were among the most anticipated events of the season, and they transformed the castle into something resembling a festival ground. Wooden stands rose along the lists outside the walls, bright with banners snapping in the wind. Merchants arrived to sell ribbons, pins, and charms said to bring victory. The Queen was expected to preside over the tilts, her seat elevated above the crowd, the sun catching the jewelled net in her hair. She would watch as armoured men thundered past on destriers, their lances shattering in splinters, the air alive with the cheers and gasps of onlookers. When a victor emerged, she would rise to present him with a token, a length of silk, a golden circlet, and to exchange a few words that would be repeated across the realm before nightfall. The days were not all spectacle. Many were given to the quieter tasks of governance, which in summer often meant settling disputes over grazing rights, fishing waters, and the boundaries of fields. These matters might seem small beside the affairs of kings, but she learned that they could breed feuds as bitter as any war. Listening to both sides, offering a decision that appeared fair to all, required patience and a careful ear. She discovered that her presence alone, even without speaking, could steady a room that was tilting toward anger. In the gardens, summer's abundance was both beauty and labour. The orchards, heavy with fruit, needed tending. The herbs were gathered for both the kitchens and the apothecary. She often walked the shaded paths with her ladies, pausing to inspect the roses or to note which plants would be dried for winter. These walks were not idle. They allowed her to be seen by those who worked the grounds, to exchange a word of thanks or a question about the season's yield. In the life of a ruler, even the smallest gesture could linger in memory for years. The summer months also brought the obligations of hospitality beyond the court itself. Visits to nearby estates were carefully arranged, each one a weaving of relationships and loyalty. She would travel with a retinue, the roads lined with villagers who stood to watch her pass. At these estates, the hosts would spare no effort in their welcome, tables groaning with food, rooms dressed with fresh flowers, entertainment ranging from minstrels to trained hawks flown for her pleasure. She accepted it all with gracious formality, leaving behind gifts that matched the care she had been shown. Evenings in summer were longer, softer. The great hall glowed with the light of many candles, but the doors stood open to let in the warm air. Music drifted into the courtyards, and laughter carried farther than it did in winter. Sometimes she joined smaller gatherings in the garden itself, seated on carved benches while musicians played, and the air filled with the mingled scents of blossoms and spiced wine. Yet even in such moments she did not entirely relax. The court was never without its watchers, and a single misstep in speech or gesture could find its way into the morning's whispers. Summer also brought the constant undercurrent of readiness for war. Though the land might be green and the days long, messages arrived that spoke of unrest in distant territories or tensions along the borders. The Queen's part in such matters was less visible than the King's, yet no less real. She might be called to receive the wives of nobles whose husbands rode to the front to assure them of the Crown's support. She might send letters to allied courts, her words chosen to soothe, to encourage, or to persuade. These letters would be read not only by their intended recipients, but by others along the way. So each one was crafted with as much care as any treaty. There were nights when she walked the battlements alone, the sky deep blue above her and the torches burning at intervals along the walls. From there she could see the river glinting faintly in the moonlight, the dark outlines of the surrounding hills, the scattered lights of the village. The castle seemed almost at peace in those hours, yet she knew that peace was never more than a careful arrangement of forces, political, personal, and divine. The height of summer was marked by the Feast of St. James, when pilgrims came through the land on their way to distant shrines. The Queen greeted some of them herself, offering bread, wine, and tokens for their journey. The act was both an expression of piety and a reminder that the crown's reach extended beyond the court's gilded chambers. She saw in their faces a mix of exhaustion, devotion, and the quiet certainty of those who believed their path was blessed. As the season reached its fullest bloom, she sensed that these months were as much a trial as the harshest winter. The warmth and abundance carried their own demands, to be always visible, always gracious, always steady, even when the air grew stifling and the weight of expectation pressed as heavily as any cloak of fur. Summer was no season of ease. It was the court in its most public form, and she its unchanging centre. By the time summer began to soften into early autumn, the air in the castle had taken on a different weight. The heat no longer pressed so heavily, and the long days were tempered by cooler evenings when the wind from the hills carried the faint scent of ripening fruit and cut hay. Yet the turning of the season was not only a change in the air, it was a shift in the court's mood, its focus moving from the splendour of summer display toward the gathering of resources and the quiet reckoning of the year's labours. Harvest season was a time when the life of the fields and the life of the castle overlapped more visibly than at any other moment. The Queen oversaw the preparations for the annual tithes, grain, honey, cheese and livestock collected from across the estates, much of which would be stored for the coming winter. She would walk through the great storage halls with the steward, noting the condition of the barrels, the neatness of the stacks, and the seals placed on goods bound for other noble houses as gifts or obligations. These visits were not mere formality. Her presence signalled that the household's abundance was under the crown's watchful eye. In the villages, the people celebrated the gathering in with music, dancing, and small feasts. It was customary for the Queen to attend at least one of these harvest festivals each year, riding out with a modest escort so as not to overshadow the people's own joy. She would watch as children crowned each other with garlands of wheat and flowers, as men and women sang in circles under the open sky. Often she brought gifts, bolts of cloth for the church, coins for the poorest families, and always she left with the image of their gratitude, a memory she carried back into the stone walls. Within the court, autumn brought its own ceremonies. The Michaelmas feast was one of the grandest, marking not only the Archangel's Day but also the settling of debts before the year's end. On this day, merchants and tradesmen came to the castle to present accounts, and the Queen was expected to hear petitions for payment or reward. In these dealings, her role was both gracious and shrewd, ensuring that those who served the court were treated fairly while protecting the crown's coffers from undue claims. Hunting, too, returned with the cooler air. The king and his lords would ride out at dawn, hounds straining at their leashes, the horns echoing through the forests. The Queen occasionally joined these hunts, not for the kill, but for the presence her attendants lent to the occasion. Her hawk, a pale goshawk with dark-tipped wings, was trained to perfection, and she took a certain quiet pride in the way it obeyed her call. On the days she did not ride, she would receive the hunters upon their return, sharing in the telling of the chase and ensuring that the spoils were divided in keeping with custom. Autumn evenings in the castle were unlike those of any other season. The air inside grew cooler, and the scent of roasting chestnuts often mingled with the ever-present wood smoke. Candles and rushlights flickered earlier in the day, casting long shadows along the corridors. It was during these evenings that the Queen found herself in more private gatherings, sometimes with her ladies, sometimes with trusted advisors, discussing plans for the winter ahead. The court, like the fields, had its own harvest to bring in, treaties to finalise, marriages to arrange, and disputes to settle before the year turned. This was also the season of pilgrims returning from their journeys, stopping at the castle to offer thanks for the hospitality or blessings they had received months earlier. They brought news from distant lands, stories of other courts, other queens, other struggles. Some of these tales she listened to with polite detachment. Others stayed with her, echoing long after the speaker had gone. She knew that each account, whether from a barefoot traveller or a silk-clad envoy, added to her own understanding of the fragile, shifting web that bound kingdoms together. In her private hours, she sometimes took to the library, a tall, narrow room lined with shelves of vellum-bound manuscripts. The air there was always cool and faintly scented with ink and dust. She would read from chronicles of past reigns, tracing with her finger the names of women who had ruled or influenced courts long before her time. Some had been celebrated for their wisdom, others condemned for ambition. All had walked the same narrow path she now walked. These quiet moments of reflection steadied her, reminding her that the challenges of her life were not hers alone, but part of a long, unbroken thread of history. As the harvest waned and the leaves turned gold and crimson, preparations for All Hallows drew near. It was a time when the court remembered its dead with solemn masses and candle-lit vigils. On that night, the chapel glowed with 100 small flames, each one lit in memory of a soul gone before. The Queen, in a gown of deep black trimmed with silver, would kneel among her people, the light catching in her hair, her head bowed. It was a moment when rank seemed to fade, when the living were united by the same quiet hope that their prayers might ease the path of those who had departed. In these weeks of gathering and remembering, the Queen moved through her duties with a steadiness that belied the undercurrents she felt around her. For even as the land gave up its bounty, there were whispers of scarcity, of tensions along the borders, of alliances that might not hold through the coming winter. She knew that autumn's beauty was fleeting, and that beneath the gold of the leaves lay the bare branches of what was to come. Still, she welcomed each day with the same composure, walking the halls in the cool morning light, listening to the hum of the castle's work. For in this season, perhaps more than any other, she felt the weight and the worth of her role, to be both the keeper of traditions and the quiet hand guiding the court toward the uncertain days ahead. The first true frost came silently in the night, leaving the courtyard grass brittle and pale, the last autumn leaves rimmed in white. By morning, the air was sharper, and the castle's stone walls seemed to hold the cold as stubbornly as they had once held the summer heat. With winter's breath already creeping through the corridors, the court's pace shifted once again, inward, closer, quieter. The Queen's mornings began earlier in this season, not because her duties had multiplied, but because the days themselves were shorter. She rose in the dimness before dawn, the room lit only by the glow of the fire her ladies had coaxed from the previous night's embers. Her gown was heavier now, the fur at its collar soft against her skin. Her hands warmed briefly over the brazier before she sat to receive the first reports of the day. Winter preparations consumed much of her attention. She walked the storerooms again, noting the state of the salted meats, the wheels of cheese stacked in careful rows, the barrels of grain sealed against damp. The apothecary's stores were checked as well. Jars of dried herbs, bundles of sage, and the precious vials of oil and honey used in remedies. She knew that in the coming months illness would walk the land more freely, and that the castle must be ready not only for its own needs, but also for those of the villages under its protection. The pace of visitors slowed with the season, but those who did come often brought matters of greater urgency. A nobleman seeking aid after his lands had been struck by early snow, a merchant desperate to secure the crown's patronage before the year's end, a messenger bearing troubling tidings from the borders. Each one was received with the same formal courtesy, her voice measured, her questions precise. She had learned that winter was a time when the smallest decision could ripple outward for months to come. Religious observances deepened in these colder months. The Advent season began with its solemn masses, and the chapel was dressed in greenery brought in from the frozen forests, a promise of life even in the heart of winter. She took part in the processions, candle in hand, the flame steady as she moved through the echoing stone. In these moments, she felt the closeness of the people around her, not in the sense of friendship, but in the shared acknowledgement of the long season ahead and the endurance it would require. Life within the castle's walls took on its own rhythm. The great hall with its roaring hearths became the centre of activity. Meals were longer, with hot stews and spiced drinks served to drive out the cold. In the afternoons, she would sometimes sit with her ladies to work on embroidery or to hear the reading of a romance or a saint's life, the sound of the words mingling with the occasional crackle of the fire. Even in these seemingly idle hours, her presence mattered. A queen's company was both an honour and a subtle reminder of her watchful role. There were entertainments suited to the season. Masked plays performed by the household's younger members, music from travelling minstrels who found shelter within the castle, games of strategy played on boards inlaid with ivory and wood. These gatherings were bright spots in the long nights, but they were also opportunities for listening. The Queen learned much in these moments, not from the performances themselves, but from the laughter that lingered too long, the glances exchanged between those who thought themselves unseen, the sudden quiet when certain names were mentioned. With winter came a different kind of intimacy between herself and the king. The long hours indoors meant more shared time, though much of it was still occupied by matters of state. There were nights when they sat together by the fire, speaking quietly of the realm's affairs, and others when their talk wandered into memories or the telling of old tales. These moments were not without their silences, but they were companionable ones built from the slow accumulation of shared years. Beyond the warmth of the hall and chamber, the world outside grew more treacherous. The roads turned to ice, and the river's edges froze. The Queen kept track of such changes not only for their effect on travel, but for what they might mean to the people who lived in the kingdom's farthest reaches. She sent word to certain villages to ensure their supplies were sufficient, dispatching small caravans of goods where needed. Her seal on each letter a quiet reassurance that they were not forgotten. As the winter deepened, the feast of Christmastide approached, bringing with it a brief but dazzling flare of colour and sound. The castle was dressed in holly and ivy, the air filled with the scent of roasted meats, mulled wine and sweetmeats dusted with sugar. The Queen's role was central in these celebrations, to welcome guests with warmth, to exchange gifts that reflected both generosity and political acumen, to preside over the dances that could carry on until the first pale light of morning. Yet once the feast days passed, the quiet returned, heavier than before. Snow often lay deep across the land, and the castle's life contracted to its innermost rooms. In this stillness, the Queen found herself reflecting more often on the year that had passed, on the faces she had welcomed and those she had lost, on the delicate balance of power and care that defined her days. Winter, she knew, was not only a test of endurance for the body, but for the will. And so she moved through its cold corridors with steady grace, her voice calm, her gaze clear. For in this season above all others, she understood the truth that had been whispered to her long ago, that a royal woman's strength was measured not in the noise she made, but in the constancy with which she could hold the centre, no matter how fierce the winds beyond the walls. The depth of winter settled over the castle like a long, unbroken breath. Snow lay thick on the roofs and walls, muting the sound of the world beyond. Inside, the air was warm near the hearths, but bitingly cold in the shadowed corridors, where the light of torches flickered against the damp stone. This was the season when time seemed to slow, each day marked less by the clock of the sun and more by the rituals that held the court together. For the Queen, January was a month of reckoning. The accounts for the previous year had to be reviewed, not only for the royal household, but for the estates and lands that fed it. She sat with the steward and the treasurer in the solar, the table before them, heavy with ledgers bound in leather, their pages filled with neat columns of numbers and marks. Every figure told a story: the cost of repairing a bridge in the north, the yield of a vineyard in the south, the tolls collected from merchants at the river crossings. She learned to see patterns in these records, where the crown's influence was strong, where it was fraying. The stillness of the season made it easier to notice the small shifts in the court's atmosphere. a lord whose laughter had grown too loud at supper, perhaps to cover a worry he dared not speak aloud, a lady who avoided certain company, a servant's sudden eagerness to carry messages. The Queen had learned that these quiet signs often mattered more than the proclamations made in the Great Hall. Winter was a time when secrets moved softly, carried in whispers through cold hallways, waiting for the thaw to set them free. Her days were filled with audiences, though fewer than in the warmer months. Petitioners arrived bundled in furs, their breath clouding the air as they bowed before her. Some sought justice in disputes over inheritance, others brought news from the countryside, reports of wolves near the villages, of barns lost to fire, of children born and elders buried. She listened to them all with the same steady patience, offering what aid she could, knowing that her presence was as important as her decisions. In the evenings, the castle gathered in closer circles. The great hall's fires roared and the walls shimmered with the play of light on the tapestries. Musicians would perform ballads old enough to have been sung to her grandmother, their melodies winding like smoke through the rafters. The Queen sat at the high table, her hands wrapped around a cup of spiced wine, watching as the courtiers laughed, played at dice, or bent over games of chess. She joined these diversions rarely, but her watchfulness was part of the fabric of the room, a quiet thread that held the pattern together. The cold months also brought a certain freedom in movement within the castle, for the demands of travel and large-scale ceremony were fewer. She spent more time in the library, where the scent of parchment and candle wax seemed untouched by the turning of the seasons. There, she read not only chronicles and psalters, but also the letters of past queens, some kept in boxes carved with the emblems of their houses. In their lines she found echoes of her own life, the same careful balancing of duty and desire, the same awareness of how much could be lost with a single misjudgment. Sometimes, in the later hours of the night, she would walk the cloisters that connected the chapel to the inner chambers. The moonlight poured through the arched windows, casting pale shapes on the flagstones. Her footsteps echoed in the emptiness, and the cold air on her face was sharp enough to wake every thought she had tried to set aside. In those moments she felt the nearness of history, the sense that countless other women had walked there before her, bearing the same mix of burdens and responsibilities, their names perhaps forgotten, but their strength still lingering in the stones. The middle of winter was marked by the Feast of Candlemas, a brief flare of light in the darkest days. The Queen took part in the blessing of the candles, her hands steady as she carried one through the chapel's nave, its small flame a reminder that even in the heart of cold light endured. Afterwards, the court shared a modest feast, not the lavishness of Christmastide, but enough to mark the turning towards spring. Yet she knew that the hardest weeks often lay between this feast and the first true thaw, when supplies began to run thin and tempers more so. This was also the time when the most delicate correspondence was sent. With travel slow, letters became the only means to reach other courts, and their words had to be chosen with precision. The Queen drafted many herself, her hand moving steadily across the vellum, each line crafted to reassure allies, to soothe old grievances, or to quietly remind certain lords of promises made. Her seal, pressed into warm wax, was as much a shield as any sword in the king's armoury. Beyond the formal duties, she made it her habit to walk among the servants more often in these months, speaking to the cooks as they worked over steaming pots, to the laundresses labouring with frozen water, to the stable hands tending horses restless from too many days indoors. These visits were not grand gestures, but they carried weight. The Queen's presence in the humbler corners of the castle was a reminder that the crown's gaze reached everywhere. As the snow fell in steady silence outside, the Queen moved through her days with the same deliberate grace she had cultivated since her arrival in this place. The cold could bite, the nights could stretch long, but she had learned that winter offered its own kind of power, the stillness to see what summer's brightness often hid, and the time to strengthen the bonds that would be tested when the world beyond the walls came alive again. By late February, the snow began to change. It no longer fell in deep, muffling drifts, but in fine, wind-driven flurries that stung the skin and left only a pale dusting across the roofs. The ice on the river cracked in places, dark water moving sluggishly beneath. Yet the cold still held, and the castle's life remained turned inward, its pulse steady and deliberate. The Queen rose each morning to the soft grey light that filtered through the tall, half-narrow windows of her chamber. Her ladies brought news of the weather first, whether the roads were passable, whether the wind had shifted toward warmth or back to the north. These details mattered as much as any state paper, for the flow of goods and people through the gates depended upon them. This was the season when the work of planning began in earnest. The year ahead was laid out not on parchment alone, but in the careful weaving of schedules, audiences, and journeys. She met often with the King's Council, not always to speak, but to listen. In these discussions, there were hints of matters not yet fully revealed, rumours of unrest in a border town, a marriage alliance being quietly considered, a tournament proposed to strengthen ties with a neighbouring court. She committed each to memory, knowing that the smallest scrap of information could later become a thread to pull or a knot to tighten. The castle's rhythm was marked by its chapel bells, their sound carrying through the cold air. Lent approached, and with it a more austere mood. Rich foods gave way to plainer fare, and the entertainments that had brightened the winter nights grew fewer. The Queen understood the importance of this solemnity. It reminded the court and the realm beyond that their rulers bowed before the same divine order as all others. She took care to be seen in acts of devotion, kneeling in prayer, walking barefoot in procession, giving alms quietly into the hands of the poor who came to the gates. Letters still came, though the journeys they required were slow and costly. One morning, a messenger arrived from the east with news that a distant cousin had taken ill. The Queen wrote at once, her words chosen to comfort, but also to strengthen the bonds between their houses. She had learned long ago that in royal correspondence, sympathy was not only an expression of the heart, but a tool of statecraft. The long evenings brought moments of rare stillness. In the great hall, the hearths roared less fiercely now, and the talk was lower, more measured. The Queen sometimes sat with her embroidery in her lap, listening as the courtiers spoke among themselves. A jest might draw laughter from one end of the table, a murmur of concern from another. She could read the balance of the court's mood without asking a single question. Her own apartments became a quieter refuge in these weeks. There, she allowed herself a small indulgence, time spent reading by the fire with only one or two trusted attendants nearby. The texts varied, devotional works, accounts of saints' lives, even the occasional verse of poetry copied for her by the scribes. In these words she found not escape but a sharpening of thought. She began to note the patterns between the histories she read and the life she lived, the way certain truths seemed to remain constant, no matter the century. Outside, the castle's guards rotated their watch in the bitter air, their boots crunching softly on the frozen ground. The Queen took care to thank them when their paths crossed, her voice carrying genuine warmth. She knew their loyalty was not only to the crown as an institution, but to the people who bore it, and that such loyalty, once earned, was worth more than any coin. As February waned, signs of the coming spring began to creep in. A patch of earth thawed near the south wall. The first crows returned to circle over the fields. These changes were small, but the Queen marked them. She knew that with the thaw would come the reopening of roads, the return of merchants, the arrival of envoys bearing news that had been waiting for the winter to break. She also knew that the quiet she had cultivated in these months would soon be gone. The long season of stillness had given her time to observe, to learn, to mend and strengthen the invisible threads that bound the court together. When the doors opened wide again and the world pressed in, it would be this unseen work that kept the walls from trembling. And so as the wind softened, only slightly, only sometimes, she prepared herself. Winter was loosening its hold, but its lessons would remain with her, tucked away like the heavy cloak she would soon set aside, ready to be called upon when the seasons turned again. With March came the first true breath of spring. It was not yet warmth, but the air had shed its biting edge, and the light fell differently through the castle windows, brighter, thinner, as though it sought out corners that had been cloaked in shadow all winter. The Queen felt it most in the mornings when the shutters were opened and the scent of damp earth drifted faintly in from the gardens. Spring was a season of renewal, but in the life of the court, it was also a season of movement. Messengers began to arrive more frequently, their horses flecked with mud from thawing roads. Merchants brought the first early goods of the year: bolts of linen, barrels of preserved lemons from the coast, baskets of dried lavender to replace the last of the previous year's store. With each arrival came news of harvests in distant lands, of political currents stirring after the stillness of winter, of lords and ladies preparing to travel again. The Queen's days grew more crowded. The first weeks of spring were devoted to reviewing and approving plans that had been laid during the cold months. The year's progressions were mapped: which estates the royal household would visit, which noble families would be received in the castle when the great feasts and tournaments would take place. These choices were not made lightly, for each carried weight. A visit to one family could be read as favour, the absence of another could breed quiet resentment. In the gardens, the work of renewal had already begun. The Queen walked there with her ladies, her mantle drawn close against the lingering chill, watching as the gardeners pruned the rose canes and turned the soil in the herb beds. She gave instructions for the planting of violets along the shaded paths, rosemary in the sunniest corner, and lilies near the fountain. These were not idle preferences. In the language of flowers known to many at court, each planting carried a message: remembrance, loyalty, purity. The chapel also took on a different aspect in spring. The Lenten season continued, but the gloom of winter's services was lightened by the lengthening days and the hope of Easter to come. The Queen attended more often now, leading processions with measured steps, the sound of the choir's voices lifting into the high vaults above. Her presence here was as much an act of governance as of devotion. It reminded all who saw her that the crown's strength rested not only on swords and treaties, but on the shared faith that bound ruler and realm. As the roads cleared, so too did the way for diplomacy. The first envoys of the year arrived with retinues small enough to travel the softened but still treacherous ways. They brought gifts, requests, and questions, some spoken plainly, others wrapped in the polite language of courtly exchange. The Queen met them with the same calm she had honed over years, offering warmth without weakness, courtesy without concession. She knew that these first impressions of the season would shape the tone of relations for months to come. In the Great Hall, the atmosphere shifted as well. The heavy winter feasts gave way to lighter fare: fresh fish from the river, early greens from the kitchen gardens, herbs steeped into fragrant broths. Musicians played brighter tunes and the talk at table turned toward plans for the warmer months. Yet beneath the liveliness, the Queen could feel the undercurrent of calculation. With the season's opening, the web of alliances and rivalries would be rewoven, and every gesture, every word, would have its place in that weaving. Her private hours grew rarer, but she still claimed them when she could. On certain mornings, she would sit in the solar with a single window open, letting in the cool air while she worked at her embroidery. The design she had chosen this season was a spray of hawthorn blossoms, a symbol of hope and renewal. As her needle passed through the linen, she thought of the year ahead, of the changes it might bring, and of the constancy she must maintain amid them. Spring also meant the return of public appearances beyond the castle walls. The Queen was expected to attend the blessing of the fields, as she had in previous years. This time, she planned to bring with her not only coins for the poor, but also baskets of bread and wheels of cheese from the royal stores, a gesture that would be spoken of in the villages long after her visit. Such acts were never forgotten, especially in places where the people's memories ran deeper than their rivers. One evening in late March, she stood on the battlements, looking out across the fields where patches of green now showed through the fading snow. The sky was streaked with pale gold, the air carrying the faint call of geese returning north. It was a moment of quiet, but also of clarity. She could feel the court awakening around her, like the land itself, and with that awakening came a greater need for her steady hand. Winter had been a season of watchfulness, but spring would demand action, measured, deliberate, and always in sight of the watching world. And so, as the last frost clung to the shadows, she readied herself to step into the season fully, knowing that the calm she carried would be as necessary as any sword at the king's side. April arrived with rain, not the harsh, freezing kind that winter sometimes flung across the land, but a steady silver rain that softened the earth and filled the air with the scent of new growth. From the high windows of the Queen's chambers, the gardens below seemed to blur and shift, their outlines dissolving in the mist. It was a season of uncertainty, when the days might hold sudden warmth or a chill that lingered until nightfall. Within the castle, this uncertainty was matched by a restless energy. The court, confined for months within its own walls, now felt the pull of open roads and distant halls. Courtiers spoke more eagerly of journeys, of estates to visit, of hunts to resume in the greening forests. The Queen heard these conversations in the great hall, in the corridors, even whispered between her ladies as they dressed her hair. She understood that such stirrings could be harmless, or they could be the beginnings of new alliances formed out of sight of the throne. Her own duties expanded with the season. Preparations for Easter began in earnest, involving not only the chapel's priests, but also the household's stewards, cooks, and musicians. The Queen oversaw the making of altar cloths embroidered with gold thread, the selection of candles for the vigil, and the planning of the feast to follow. These details were not trivial. The care she took in them reflected the reverence of the crown, and any oversight would be noted by those ever eager to find fault. In the gardens, the first flowers began to appear, snowdrops along the shaded walls, violets in the sheltered corners. The Queen walked there in the softer afternoons, her mantle drawn against the damp air, speaking with the head gardener about which beds would be turned for planting and which trees needed pruning. She found a kind of quiet satisfaction in these tasks, for they reminded her that some labours bore fruit not in days or weeks, but in their own season. The arrival of Easter brought with it a rare blending of solemnity and joy. On the morning of the feast, the Queen dressed in a gown of pale green silk, its sleeves lined with white fur to guard against the lingering chill. She led the procession into the chapel, the sound of bells filling the air, the scent of lilies heavy around the altar. When the Mass was done, she distributed coins and bread to the poor gathered outside the gates, her hands chilled by the air but warmed by the sight of their gratitude. The feast that followed was a display of the court's abundance: roasted lamb, fish dressed with herbs, loaves of fine white bread, and sweet pastries glazed with honey. The Queen sat at the high table beside the King, her presence as much a part of the celebration as the music and dancing that followed. Yet even amid the joy, she noted who spoke with whom, which toasts were raised with genuine warmth, and which with a thin edge of formality. These small observations were threads she would later weave into her understanding of the court's shifting patterns. As the days grew longer, the castle opened itself to more visitors. Noble families arrived to pay their respects, bringing gifts of their own, casks of wine from the south, embroidered hangings, carved reliquaries. Each was accepted with gracious words and entered into the records, for every gift carried with it an unspoken expectation. The Queen's task was to meet these expectations without binding the crown too tightly in obligation. The spring rains brought challenges as well. Roads became rivers of mud, delaying messengers and causing some supplies to arrive spoiled or late. The Queen addressed these troubles with the same calm she brought to greater matters, ensuring that replacements were sent where needed, and that those responsible for the delays were reminded, gently but firmly, of their duties. She had learned that small lapses, if left unattended, could grow into greater failings. By the end of April, the first warm days came. On one of these, the Queen sat in the outer courtyard while petitions were brought to her. It was an old custom meant to show that the ruler's justice was open to all. Peasants knelt before her with disputes over land boundaries. A craftsman requested permission to sell his goods within the castle market. A young woman sought the crown's help in securing her dowry. Each case was heard with patience, and each decision made with an awareness that it would be carried far beyond the walls by those who received it. One evening, after the day's business had ended, the Queen walked alone to the West Tower. From there, she could see the river bending away toward the horizon, its surface gleaming with the light of the setting sun. The trees along its banks were faintly green now, their bare branches dressed in the first leaves. She thought of how swiftly the seasons turned, how winter's stillness had already become a memory, and how the months ahead would bring more change than the court yet knew. In the shifting light, she felt the familiar weight of her role, constant in every season, yet always demanding something new. And as the first swallows wheeled in the air above the river, she understood that spring was not only a time of beginnings, but also of preparation for what was to come, both seen and unseen. June unfolded in a blaze of light. The days stretched so long that the first birdsong arrived before the castle's bells, and the last streaks of dusk lingered even after the torches had been lit along the walls. Warm air drifted through the high windows, carrying with it the mingled scents of roses, cut hay, and the faint tang river water. For the Queen, this was the height of the year's demands, when every hour seemed to belong to someone else. The season began with the Feast of Pentecost, a celebration that filled the great hall with the sound of trumpets and the shimmer of silk and gold. Lords and ladies from across the realm gathered for Mass, their voices rising together in the hymns, before moving into the hall for a banquet that lasted deep into the afternoon. The Queen presided beside the King, accepting gifts from visiting nobles, jewel-encrusted cups, bolts of fine cloth, reliquaries carved from ivory. Each token carried a message, and her acceptance was as deliberate as her thanks. With the roads now fully open, diplomacy moved at a faster pace. Envoys came not only from nearby provinces but from foreign courts, bringing news of shifting alliances, trade agreements and disputes. The Queen received them in her private audience chamber, a room designed for both comfort and formality. She listened to their words with the same calm patience she had shown in winter, but her questions were sharper now, aimed at revealing more than was offered. Often she would take what she learned and weave it quietly into her council with the King. Tournaments marked the high summer weeks, and they transformed the castle's outer grounds into a spectacle of colour and noise. The lists were set up on the meadow beyond the moat, the stands draped in banners that snapped in the wind. The Queen's seat was placed high enough for her to see every tilt, every clash of shield and lance. She presented the victor's prize with a few carefully chosen words, her voice carrying over the crowd. It was more than ceremony. It was a moment when the crown touched the hearts of the people through the pageantry they loved. Within the castle walls, the heat of summer changed the rhythm of daily life. The great hearths were left cold and the meals were lighter. Fresh fish from the river, salads of herbs and greens, fruits brought in from nearby orchards. The Queen dined in the shaded solar more often than in the hall, receiving smaller groups of guests in a setting where conversation could be more easily steered. Here, away from the roar of public feasts, she could speak plainly to those whose counsel she valued most. The gardens reached their full beauty in June. Paths shaded by trellises of climbing roses led to fountains where the water caught the sunlight like silver threads. The Queen walked there daily, sometimes with her ladies, sometimes alone, allowing herself a few moments of quiet among the ordered blooms. She knew the gardeners by name and asked after their work, her interest genuine. Such attentions, though small, built a loyalty that could not be bought. Summer also brought the obligations of hospitality beyond the court itself. The Queen travelled to several noble estates, each visit carefully planned to strengthen alliances. She was received with lavish banquets, hunts and entertainments, but she looked beyond the glitter to the state of the lands and the mood of the people. She noted whether the storehouses were full, whether the tenants seemed content or wary, whether her hosts spoke openly or guardedly. Every observation became part of her understanding of the realm's true condition. In the evenings, when the day's heat softened, the court often gathered in the outer courtyards. Musicians played under the open sky, and the sound of lutes and recorders mingled with the hum of conversation. Torches cast shifting shadows on the stone, and the air was warm enough to need no cloak. The Queen sat at the heart of these gatherings, her presence both a signal of welcome and a quiet reminder that even in leisure, the Crown's gaze did not falter. June was also a month of private council. The Queen met with the King to discuss the matters that could not be spoken of in public. The loyalties of certain lords, the possibility of unrest in distant towns, the marriage alliances being considered for younger members of the royal family. These talks were not hurried. They unfolded slowly, with pauses for thought and the weighing of each word. She knew that in such moments, her influence was at its most potent, for here she was not the figure of ceremony, but the partner in governance. By the month's end, the court had reached its most vivid state, a place of constant movement, of colours and voices, of plans made and unmade. The Queen moved through it all with the same composed grace she had cultivated through every season, her presence steady amid the heat and brightness. And though the days were long, she understood that this height of summer would pass quickly, giving way to the next turning of the year and the changes it would bring. July arrived with a weight of heat that pressed against the castle walls and lingered in the still air of its halls. The mornings began with a haze over the fields, the grass silvered with dew that vanished almost as soon as the sun rose. By midday, the stones underfoot radiated warmth, and the river below moved slowly, its surface shimmering under a relentless light. The Queen's chambers, though shaded by heavy curtains, could not entirely keep the summer from entering. This was the season when the court reached its most visible splendour. The King's progress through the realm was planned for these months, and with it came the Queen's own public duties. Together they would travel to towns and estates, the roads lined with people eager to see them pass. The Queen rode at the King's side, her gown chosen to speak of dignity and grace, her crown light enough to be worn for hours beneath the sun. Every wave of her hand, every glance toward the crowd was observed and remembered. The journeys were not without their trials. Heat made the air heavy within the enclosed carriages, and the dust of the road clung to skin and fabric alike. Yet the Queen bore it without complaint, for these appearances were more than tradition. They were a living display of the Crown's presence, a reminder to the farthest corners of the realm that they were seen. In each place they stopped, she visited the local church, offered gifts to the poor, and met with the wives of the leading men to speak of the welfare of their households. Back within the castle, the demands of summer did not lessen. Tournaments continued, hunts were arranged in the cooler hours of dawn, and banquets stretched far into the night. The Queen's role in these was constant, to receive guests with warmth, to speak with all who sought her ear, and to ensure that the tone of the court remained steady, no matter how the heat or the wine might loosen tongues. The gardens, now at their fullest, became a place of both respite and responsibility. The Queen walked among the shaded paths with her ladies, pausing to admire the deep red roses and the tall spires of foxglove. Yet even here, conversation often turned to matters of state, the progress of the harvest, the reports from border towns, the conduct of certain courtiers. The still beauty of the garden served as a setting for decisions that would reach far beyond its walls. In July, foreign envoys often came bearing the weight of negotiations begun in spring. They arrived with retinues dressed in the colours of their lands, their speech formal and deliberate. The Queen met them in the audience chamber, where the air was cooled by heavy draperies and bowls of fresh herbs placed near the windows. Here, she listened, asked questions, and offered responses shaped to both reassure and reserve. Her manner was the same, whether the matter concerned trade, marriage, or the more delicate business of peace between uneasy allies. Evenings brought some relief from the day's heat. The great hall, open at its western end, filled with the sound of music and the low hum of conversation. The Queen sat where she could be seen by all, her gown light but no less elegant for the season. She joined in the toasts, spoke kindly to those who approached her, and allowed herself, now and then, the quiet pleasure of listening to a well-played song or a story told with skill. Yet summer also had its tensions. The warmth that brought life to the fields could just as easily bring drought, and the Queen heard reports of certain villages where the wells were running low. She sent word that water should be brought in from the nearest rivers, and that the crown's stores would be opened if the harvest failed. These decisions, though not yet urgent, were made with the foresight that had served her through many seasons. In the stillest hours of the night, when the castle lay quiet and the air hung heavy, the Queen sometimes walked the outer walls. From there she could see the dark shapes of the sleeping fields, the faint gleam of the river, and the far lights of villages beyond the reach of the torches. The heat seemed less pressing in these moments, the silence more complete. It was here she often reflected on the years turning, on the winter past, the spring's slow unfurling, and the fullness of life that summer brought. She knew this fullness would not last. Already she could feel in the shifting light of late afternoon a hint of the season's decline, the faintest shadow of what would come when the days grew shorter again. But for now, July was hers to hold. A month of brightness and burden, of public display and private resolve. And she moved through it with the same calm certainty that had carried her through every turn of the year.